This is Law Bites, a podcast with Michael Geist.
Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen arrived on Capitol Hill with a blunt message. Unless lawmakers force the tech giant to change how it operates, democracy, public safety, and the mental health of young users all remain at risk.
The company's leadership knows how to make Facebook and Instagram safer, but won't make the necessary changes because they have put their astronomical profits before people.
Haugen clearly outlined concrete steps to rein in Facebook, including creating a new regulatory agency to increase oversight and to require Facebook to disclose internal research. Haugen claimed Facebook uses addictive algorithms and that the company has done secret experiments showing vulnerable users can be led to content promoting anorexia, while it also found some teen girls experience an increase in body image problems while using Instagram.
Facebook has once again found itself in the political spotlight as Frances Haugen, a former data scientist and product manager with the company turned whistleblower, provided the source documents for an explosive investigative series in the Wall Street Journal, followed by an appearance before a U.S. Senate committee. The Facebook Files series comes just as Canada is moving toward its own legislative response to internet concerns with an online harms consultation that provides the roadmap for future policies. The Canadian consultation has sparked widespread criticism, but recent events may only increase the urgency for legislative action. Taylor Owen is the Beaverbrook Chair in Media Ethics and Communications, the founding director of the Center for Media Technology and Democracy, and an associate professor in the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University. He is also the host of the Big Tech Podcast, a terrific podcast on digital policy. He joins me on this podcast to discuss the latest revelations and what they might mean for the future of Canadian internet regulation. Taylor, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
My pleasure.
As you know, and you've been intimately involved, questions related to online harm, social media regulation have, of course, been with us now for a number of years, but they've been garnering even, I think, more attention in recent weeks. It feels like in Canada, there are at least a couple of tracks that are moving a little bit in parallel that I think are almost bound to intersect, raising real questions about the future of Canadian policy. We, of course, have the revelations about Facebook's internal research from Frances Haugen, first reported in the Wall Street Journal, 60 Minutes interview, and then, of course, the congressional hearing. And then there's the Canadian government's own work in this area. An online harms consultation took place over the summer and clear indications that legislation's forthcoming. Now, I want to focus on that future intersection, what the Haugen revelations are likely to mean for Canadian policy. But let's start by unpacking, in a sense, both of those tracks, starting, I guess, with Frances Haugen. For those who haven't been following, can you give a bit of background on who she is and what she's revealed?
I think you framed it the right way, which is that it was a series of leaked documents. So she was a project manager at some level this is integrity or one of the integrity teams at Facebook, and clearly had access to a large amount of the internal research that Facebook, to their great credit, I think, does about the effect their platform has on their users. And I think we should put a pin in that, right? That a lot of other platforms don't do that research. So it's actually really great to know it's being done and being done by smart, thoughtful people internally inside the company. Anyway, she had access to these data and this research, and it wasn't just her leak or the moment of her testimony. It was thousands of pages of documents that were provided to the Wall Street Journal, as you mentioned, which did 5 separate sort of investigative reports into different aspects of those data and that research. And then, of course, her own testimony and her own media she's been doing. And look, I think there's been a lot of different, obviously, there's been a string of leaks or whistleblowers or however we want to frame people who have worked and experienced the inside of some of these companies and have then stepped out to raise concerns publicly. But I do think, and I think that there's a string of these is important. We increasingly get a bigger window into what are what are often black boxes here, which is frankly part of the problem, which we'll talk about. But she did do something very specific, I think, and that is confirm to a certain degree some of the harms that people from outside, and I would put that category quite broadly to be certainly researchers who attempt to study these platforms, but also civil society groups who have been documenting harms to their constituencies and in their areas of domain for years and years now, both domestically and more importantly, perhaps internationally, and also investigative journalists. So we've had these kind of three outside lenses looking in at these platforms for going on a decade now, at times raising awareness of harms they've seen, and those almost uniformly have been denied by the platforms themselves, that these harms exist. And what I think Frances has done, which is powerful, is say there is knowledge of these harms, that we too study these internally with access to far greater data than anyone from outside, and we see some of these harms as well. And in addition to that, we often make strategic choices between minimizing harm and maximizing the core of our business, or at least acknowledge that there's a tension between those two things, between harm, minimizing harm, and profit. And we don't always know where they land on that. I think it's very clear that very often they land on minimizing harm, at least in the case of Facebook. But there's now an acknowledgement of that tension from inside. And I think that's important because really it is at the core of a lot of the policy ideas I think we should be putting on the table.
Yeah, that's interesting. So Haugen now has placed all of this. She's obviously got a lot of attention. What is she suggesting needs to be done, in her view, to try to address some of these issues?
And this is where I think, from my perspective, is someone like you who's sort of engaged in thinking about this policy direction and its complexity, frankly. I think that perhaps that is the biggest sort of assistance that's been provided here to this discourse, in that, and partly she's doing this because she's speaking primarily to a US government audience or legislative audience, but she is urging policymakers to move away from the conversation about governing speech and towards governing those incentive structures, that tension that she raised. And she's suggesting to do it by providing greater transparency mechanisms over how this system works, so that not only internal researchers, but everybody can see the consequences of these various decisions. And on top of that, a level of accountability measures to ensure that that tension is determined in the broad public interest. So transparency and accountability measures over the system itself, rather than focusing on the symptoms or the outcome of that system, which is the acts of speech. And I think that's really important for a whole host of reasons we can talk about. But just to flag two, to direct us here. I mean, one is, as you know far better than me, speech is like a very, very difficult thing to adjudicate. And it is different in every country and in every jurisdiction. There are very few clear lines, even on speech we determine to be illegal. And certainly that's the case in Canada, which we can talk about. But the second is just the scale of it. And which is, of course, mind-boggling. Facebook alone says they have 2.7 billion users and 100 billion pieces of content in 4,000 languages a day. So any governance conversation or solution that focuses on the very imprecise definition of harmful speech, combined with the vast scale of speech acts that we're talking about, is kind of doomed to fail. And that's where a lot of this policy debate has been stuck for years now. And I think it's understandable we've gone there first, because it's the thing we see and feel. It's the product of the system. And so that's what we see. and it's some of it's awful, and some of it's really damaging and really harmful. But that doesn't necessarily mean that addressing that speech is the right policy way in to minimizing it.
Yeah, no, in a sense, she sees the problem, she sees the incentives as you've suggested for these companies, and the argument seems to be that the way that you get out the kind of harms that come out of the so-called symptoms, in a sense, is to go to that underlying structure and to.
Well, at least if you do that, then we'll know how many of the speech harms that might fix, right? And then maybe it's a much smaller problem. Yeah. You may still need to, and I'm curious what you think about this, but at some point you may need to still deal with the illegal speech. That's an outcome of this system. But perhaps we can minimize it going first by going after some of these structural elements.
Well, I think that's right. Listen, illegal speech is illegal for a reason. We're already regulating it in some way.
Well, whether we can enforce it or not is the question.
It's the question, and it's also, I also think, and this brings us nicely to what's on the table in Canada, is that treating all of these kinds of speech as the same from a regulatory perspective, as if child pornography is the same as online hate. And so we're going to use the same tools, same enforcement measures, same takedown possibilities for all of this kind of content, because it ticks a certain box, is where you start running into real risks.
That's a really important point, I think. I mean, so the way they run this down, right, is the 5 different categories of illegal speech. And I think you're right. They are in some ways fundamentally different. And they probably need to be addressed in a more sort of targeted, bespoke way.
Yeah, I think that's right. Now let's talk for a moment about the Canadian situation. So the government over the spring started down the road of its internet regulation approach. There was Bill C-10, which listeners will be familiar with, since I spent a lot of time focusing on it, which of course involved the broadcast regulation and then spilled over onto user-generated content. But in some sense, the bigger piece is this online harms piece, which the government, about a week or two before the election call, launches an online consultation that doesn't really ask a lot of questions as much as it signals, here's where we're intending to go. And I've talked about it with Cynthia Koo on a prior podcast, blogged about it pretty extensively, including, I should note, it's I think, an inexplicable decision to keep the submissions it received as part of this consultation now secret. So they're not even revealing them. It's only those that have been made available by the people who do the submitting that we have. But why don't we start with your take on that consultation and what the government is thinking about, and then kind of we'll take that and bridge it to Haugen's recommendation to focus on accountability and transparency.
Yeah, so I think it's important, as you say, to put this in the context of other legislative efforts in the past year or two. I would add the Privacy Act to that, C-11. I actually think that some of the things we're talking about here could be perhaps better addressed via that, by increasing the rules around data collection, if we're looking at the real incentives and structures of the way these systems work. But also the Broadcast Act, which in my view, made the significant mistake of drifting into the speech regulation space. To me, I don't know that policy area particularly well and don't pretend to, but it seems to me that you could have gotten at most of the concerns that were central to the Broadcast Act without touching on user-generated content and avoiding this conversation, a debate about its implications on speech before we had the actual conversation about a bill that actually deals with speech, which is, of course, C-36 and the online harm legislation. So I guess a few thoughts I have about that. I mean, look, I think the most of the critiques that I've heard come out are really important and correct. And I think a lot of those critiques and concerns were provided in the buildup to the writing of this legislation and heard by the government. So why did they choose not to listen to them? Like that to me is a core question here. Like when you think of the broad stakeholders who are involved in this kind of legislation that touches on so many aspects of civil society, the legal community, the digital governance community, why that consultation, the consultation that was done, wasn't internalized more effectively, I don't understand. So that's one thing. On the piece of legislation itself, I mean, look, I think that they made three. I think there's three things that are problematic from my perspective. One is the 24-hour takedown regime. I think it's pretty clear that there have been real consequences to that kind of regime when imposed in Germany, for example. We now know a fair amount about both how platforms reacted in response and what the consequence of that reaction was on over censoring certain kinds of content. So I think they made a mistake going down that path, and my sense is they did that because it was in their mandate letter, which to me is not a very good reason to impose a policy that many people have warned will have these sort of negative consequences, despite the intent, which I think isn't necessarily bad. The second is the IP blocking provision. I think while I understand the challenge of what a government does when they can't enforce their own laws on a platform. So what do you do if a platform is not abiding by your either legal or regulatory regime? Using that tool as if you've argued incredibly persuasively, takes us down a path we don't go, and is a bit of a poison pill in this thing. The third challenge, I think, is around what Cynthia Koo, I think, detailed really helpfully in your interview with her, but also in the memo or the consultation document she did with Lex Gill and Christopher Parsons, which is around mandatory data reporting requirements to the RCMP and potentially new powers to CSIS based on that. And I think they're right that one, this incentivizes potentially over collection of data and oversharing of very sensitive data between platforms and the government, and also just steps out of the kind of domain of this particular piece of legislation and into something else that deserves more scrutiny and more separate conversation, which is empowering CSIS to do more things with these kinds of data. So look, I think those three things are, from my view, problematic with this piece of legislation. Then what to do about that, right? Because I actually think, and here's where I think we might disagree a little bit, and other people might as well. I do think there's some core things in this legislation that are not in themselves deal breakers if we define and empower them appropriately.
Let me give you the chance then to pick up on that. What do you see as some of the positive things as part of this consultation?
Well, look, I mean, I think the government was faced with a choice here, as many governments are, who want to put in some sort of more regulatory framework for platforms or internet communication, of whether to continue to provide new powers to existing regulatory bodies. In Canada, there were many people arguing that this should be the CRTC, and CRTC arguing it most vocally, I guess. And that's the direction the UK went, right? Empowering Ofcom in all sorts of different ways to move into the digital space. And I think they correctly said, no, this space is fundamentally different. Therefore, we are a new regulatory body for these sorts of questions, and they proposed this digital safety commissioner. So I think in principle, that was the right decision. Now the question is, what should this digital safety commissioner do? How should they be empowered by legislation? That's something we should talk about. I also think the idea of a recourse council, which is the second piece of this regulatory architecture they've proposed, isn't in and of itself a bad idea. Scholars around the world have been proposing something like an e-tribunal, right? So some kind of recourse mechanism for citizens of democratic societies to challenge the decisions over their speech made by companies sitting outside of their countries. Now, I think there's a debate about what that should be, right? Should that be something like a literal complaint mechanism and almost sort of trial-like or tribunal-like process for individual decisions? Or should it be something more like the oversight board, Facebook's oversight board, that provides kind of general comment and guidance to set precedent on these companies? And I think we can debate how that could be made up. But the idea that we would have a kind of third-party adjudicating group that sits outside of the companies, to me, isn't crazy in a democratic society. And not just absolving all those decisions to private entities. And the third piece of that structure is this advisory board. They're calling the advisory board. Many people have argued for a social media council. Article 19 has called, for example, for a global social media council. This would be sort of a Canadian version of it, which is sort of a group of stakeholders, essentially, industry, academic, civil society, who play some role in guiding and advising the regulatory body. It's like, on the surface, three things I can see the argument, and I think very useful. The question is what you empower them to do. And that's where we get into sort of the details here that I think can be challenging, and where the government's gotten in a bit of a few problems by being both vague and too specific at the same time in different ways.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. It's a really interesting take where it sounds like you're comfortable with the direction that they're moving from a governance structure perspectives, that the argument being that our current structures may not be well suited to deal with this, or we would do better with some new ones that are well situated to deal with the kinds of issues that we've been talking about around online harms and the like. But the very sorts of powers or solutions that they're proposing that might be injected into the system give real pause and are in some instances cause for concern.
Absolutely. And one thing, just one additional point there I think is really important, is that structure, those three pieces don't come out of thin air. These are things that are being discussed or tried in other jurisdictions around the world. So there's been a lot of critique about this Canadian piece of legislation, I think rightfully being way out ahead and picking bad ideas from around the world and imposing fairly draconian measures on speech. And I think, honestly, some of that critique has been valid. But those three pieces of these three governance tools are pulled from, in some ways, practice internationally. And I do think the government did look and talk to other governments about what was working, what wasn't. And there have been a lot of those ideas come from things that are being pushed in the US, things that are being pushed in the EU, the better parts of the DSA, for example, like what's worked in other countries. So like that structure itself is, to me, potentially a good path here. The question is what they do.
And speaking of that global perspective, and you're right that many of the proposals are at least in part taken from the experience elsewhere. You've mentioned both for the good, let's say in the case of 24-hour takedowns, or perhaps better in terms of some of the attempts to try to develop some of the governance structures. One of the concerns that we've seen raised from groups both within Canada and elsewhere is what this might mean from a reputational perspective for Canada, especially with respect to the speech regulation piece, where Canada often likes to see itself, as a leader in this regard, and the concern that somehow if we move forward with this without necessarily the sorts of due process that we'd expect, the sorts of safeguards that we'd expect, and instead making the case that, as between online harms and freedom of expression, we're going to take regulating online harms, even if there's a real cost to freedom of expression, that in the hands of autocratic regimes and some of other countries, they may hold up Canada to justify their approaches. And in some ways, we can become a poster child for some really bad stuff that could happen elsewhere. You have any thoughts on what this could mean from a reputational perspective? How do we grapple with our role sort of in the global community when it comes to these issues?
Look, absolutely. I mean, a reflection on that challenge here, and then also specific what I think the opportunity rather than damage that could come from this reputationally. But I do think there's a real challenge in this policy space. In what way will domestic laws be interpreted that in our case would be developed democratically, in a democratic society? Could they be used rhetorically or mimicked in ways that could be used in a liberal ends in other countries? I think is one dynamic here, and that's not a problem that's necessarily unique to this policy space. It's very often the case in all sorts of policy domains they're replicated for liberal ends in other contexts. But I think there's a bigger issue here. And I had a wonderful conversation on my podcast with Jamil Jaffer, I'm sure you know well, who I have a tremendous amount of respect for in this debate. And I asked him whether we in democratic societies that aren't the United States, in Western Europe, so Canada, who have different speech laws and regulations than the United States. We don't have a First Amendment. We protect the right to not be harmed alongside the right to speech in ways that aren't sort of balanced quite the same way in the United States. But in the interest of protecting the speech rights of people in a liberal regimes, should we accept a change in our own? So should we be okay with accepting more of a free speech oriented, First Amendment oriented version of free speech in our society in order to protect individuals in other countries, in liberal regimes, where that First Amendment vision that they are able to take advantage of using these platforms is far preferable than the liberal one from their own regimes? And I don't have a good answer to that. I think that's a really wicked problem at the center of this. And it's one thing to make that decision in Canada, where we sit fairly closely already to American free speech norms and laws. But what if I'm a German citizen and I've decided as a society, as a democratic society, that Nazi hate speech will be illegal? And we're willing to go to great lengths to ensure it doesn't repropagate in my society. Should I make that same trade-off? And I don't have a good answer for that. So that's just these issues, these global versus domestic jurisdictions issues, I think are really complicated and get at some of the real, almost moral dilemmas that are at the heart of a lot of these policy debates. On the reputational damage, though, just really quickly, I actually think yes, if we go down the current path, I do think there will be reputational damage. I think there already has been, because this policy space is new and rapidly evolving and difficult. And what that demands of democratic governments, I think, is to learn from the experiences of others. Because not everyone will get everything right in such a complex policy area every time. So when we see Germany try something, in this case, the 24-hour takedown regime, and we see potentially negative consequences to that, we should learn from it and iterate on it. And I think the way this legislation is currently packaged does not do that sufficiently. However, the inverse is also true, that I do think there is some consensus emerging internationally amongst the various both pretty diverse stakeholder groups who are interested in this topic, but also the governments that are trying to implement legislation in this space. That there are some things one can do in both the transparency space and the accountability space that are almost the low-hanging fruit of this, but could make a real difference. And would, I think, garner fairly broad buy-in from these various stakeholders. And if the government were to empower this regulatory regime, which we can debate whether that's the right structure or not, and I think that's a legitimate conversation. But if this package of regulatory bodies were to exist, or governance structure were to exist, if we empowered it to ensure that we were getting significantly more data out of these companies so that we could all, the public, citizens, researchers, and governments, hold them to better account. If we were providing better windows in some of the algorithmic systems that we know are shaping in important ways, both good and bad, our experiences online. If we had some mechanisms to hold companies accountable for things that we deem to be fundamentally harmful, those things could actually, I think, demonstrate to the world that we're learning from what's happening internationally, and we're building what at the moment, because again, this is a process that countries have to iterate on, that at the moment should be seen as being at the front edge of where this policy conversation is. And that could be a reputational benefit. We could be seen as sort of a governance leader in this rather than a laggard.
So there's an opportunity here to kind of flip the script a little bit. If we move in a direction that shifts away from some of the things that have been put on the table to date, and instead learn the lessons that Frances Haugen's been talking about. Now you're talking about focus not on the symptoms but on the broader structures, and the way forward includes transparency, accountability, and I think you notably raised as well earlier on. Bill C-11 and the data piece of this as well as an important part of that overall package of potential reforms that could go a long way to addressing some of these concerns. I
think it'll have it will demand, I think, a revisiting of C-11. I think that's certainly part of it, and it may even require a discussion of competition policy in Canada and the current salience of the Competition Act. So I think there's many ways we can get into this, but even just in this online harms piece, I think there's a potential refocusing here that could, I think, have an impact on both how we govern the space, but also the direction other democratic societies are going.
I think I agree with you. I think there are opportunities. The question will be whether or not there is a willingness on the government to set aside the direction that it's been moving in the past. And, you mentioned a little bit earlier that it's at a certain level, it's tough to reconcile a government that talks about consultation and that is clearly wants to be actively engaged in this. And yet groups from across the political spectrum had raised these concerns, and yet the government marched on. They did the same thing with respect to C-10. And so I guess the question is, will the election and the chance for a bit of a reset also involve a bit of a reset on these policies as well?
I mean, boy, I wish I knew the answer to that, because I don't know either. But I do think there's an interesting question here of what does a reset look like? Is this a wholesale restart of all three of these pieces of legislation, or are there things that could be evolved from each of them that would resolve some of these challenges we've been talking about? And I think I tend to lean in the latter there, just because these processes take so long. This is 2 years of work that I don't know, I'd be hesitant to just restart because some of these issues are really urgent, I believe. But maybe that's not possible. Maybe it is a whole reset.
We'll see. And obviously, we're likely to get new ministers and the government acting potentially on this. They say within the first 100 days of a new parliament, just literally in the weeks and months ahead. Yep. Taylor, thanks so much for joining me on the podcast.
Hey, my pleasure.
That's the Law Bites podcast for this week. If you have comments, suggestions, or other feedback, write to lawbites@pobox.com. Follow the podcast on Twitter @lawbitespod or Michael Geist at mgeist. You can download the latest episodes from my website at michaelgeist.ca or subscribe via RSS at Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify. The Law Bites podcast is produced by Gerardo Lebron Laboy. Music by the Laboy brothers, Gerardo and Jose Lebron Laboy. Credit information for the clips featured in this podcast can be found in the show notes for this episode at michaelgeist.ca. I'm Michael Geist. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.